economics, specifically on financial contracts, looking at microfinance contracts, insurance contracts for farmers in developing countries. I've done a lot of field work. I have mostly worked in Tanzania. That's been a place where I've been kind of traveling back and forth to when I was in grad school, and now that I'm a professor, I send my students there, and every chance I get, I try to go there myself as well. So this topic is a little bit outside my sort of normal interest and research, but it's definitely something that it's part of a huge part of development economics, and it's something that's absolutely very interesting. I do teach AED 4535, which is also cross-listed with international studies. It's a development economics class for undergrads. And I also teach the advanced development economics class for PhD students in our department. So in case you guys are thinking of moving on and get a PhD here as well, then maybe good to take my class sometime in the future. And I don't recognize any of you guys. Have you guys taken my undergrad development class? Okay, and you guys are seniors, so it's too late, I guess.
We're juniors.
Oh, you're juniors, okay.
Yes, don't explain.
Okay,
Yeah.
So I'll get to the introductions later, but in case you guys want to take that, I am teaching that in the fall of every year. So I'll be teaching that again in the fall. So why don't we just quickly go through and just kind of give me a 2-minute version of what you're interested in, where you've traveled to, what kind of development experience that you have. So let's start with you.
I'm Brittany. I'm a senior. My major is animal sciences.
Okay.
I've been to Spain. I went there over winter break.
Okay.
It was a human, animal, and interactions trip.
Okay.
So we did like a bunch of different fields related to animals. So we went to a zoo. We went to a couple different production facilities. We went to a college there in the animal science department. Went to bull breeding farm, bull ring.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, it was off season, so we didn't get to see a fight, but we got to learn a lot about it.
Okay.
And then in May, I'm going to South Africa.
Okay, wow. Where in South Africa?
We are going to a bunch of different places. I know we're going to be in Kruger for 3 days.
Okay.
We're going to the big rhino breeding facility there, the John Hume facility.
Okay.
We're going to a couple sanctuaries.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
It'll be an exotic behavior trip.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And you're animal science, you said, and you're a senior?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Technically graduating in the summer, but it's just because the study abroad is like a summer class.
Sure. Okay, exciting. And you?
I'm Kayla Walls. I'm a junior studying agri-science education, and the reason I have to take it now is because next spring I'll be doing my student teaching.
Okay.
So I won't be on campus, but I traveled to Brazil for 6 weeks.
Okay. Where in Brazil? Huge country.
Sao Paulo.
Sao Paulo, yeah.
Yeah, the state mostly, and then Piracicaba is where we stayed.
Okay.
Most of the time we studied at university for the first 3 weeks, and then the last 3 we just went on a long trip over towards Paraguay and Argentina. Okay. And then kind of down and back up. So.
Did you study development there at all, or?
Mostly economics.
Okay.
A little bit of like environmental sustainability, a lot of history and culture. And
somebody else was
yeah. Beating down the walls to come.
And your major again was, sir?
Agri-science education.
Agri-science education.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And we studied a lot of Portuguese, just like the language. But then in May, I'll be going to Ghana on a service learning trip for a month.
So that's great. Yeah. We have a potential project in Ghana. I was there a year and a half ago doing some initial scouting, talking to institutions there and seeing there's something we could do. That it's a great place to work as well.
Our program is over on the far western side, over in Ho, the Volta region.
Okay.
Yeah. And actually, that's a good segue.
Yeah.
I'm Cody McLean. I'm also a junior studying agri-science education. So next year I'm doing student teaching. And I've traveled 2 different places. One was Ghana, which is the same trip Caleb will be traveling today, where we studied the arts in Ghana and then also do some service learning work. Okay. So for example, we got to teach in the local schools, teach enrichment courses, which was really neat, good teaching experience across cultures. Then this previous May, I went to Honduras, Chilteca, Honduras, and studied there, mostly focused on community development, community education. Okay. So that's a little bit about me. I really enjoy studying abroad and going. I even like traveling to the U.S. I just like to go across and see different cultures and really focus on teaching across those cultures and how to connect in the classrooms. That's kind of what my research here is.
Okay. How long were you in Honduras?
Honduras for 2 weeks.
Okay.
The first week was incredible. The second week, Cody was really sick.
Okay.
Still was a good experience,
that's
but Cody was
Safety
really
for third persons.
It was the sickest I've ever been.
Gotta look at yourself and it's like, wow, I'm in this beautiful
It's like
country.
out of body.
Yes. So you developed a strong appreciation for medicine.
That's one of those beautiful inventions that we have that keep people around for longer.
Yes.
Which everyone would have access to, but this is not a talk of health, even though that would have been a fun one as well, I'm sure.
Right. We do have a program in Tanzania, and some of the people online asynchronously,
Mm-hmm.
in particular Hillary, did a program in the Marwa area of Kilimanjaro, where they were focusing on water, the combination engineering, environment, natural resource program. So I've been to Dodoma and
I've done a fair bit of research in Dodoma.
Uni Dodoma, Dar es Salaam, and then I've been up to the Marwa region to see the projects.
Okay, great. And you're a PhD candidate?
I am.
Okay.
Yeah, but I've been working here in the office like 17 years now.
Okay.
So it's a slow boat. Yeah.
But you're doing your research in this, so
I am
correct me if you might be more of an expert than I am.
Well,
but,
not this area. Actually, I'm more about the cultural competence and gains through study abroad. But I took one class in regional development and fell in love, but I was already down the path too far to change.
Yeah. And as I mentioned in the email to you, I'm not a regional person, so I don't have much of a regional focus. I'm a development economist, so we kind of think about development impacts.
Sure.
So it might be a little bit different from take than Alessandra was doing, but
You're the expert, not me.
well, let's see. So let's kind of figure out what some of the questions that we want to ask. I always like to introduce my classes with some questions, kind of motivates the topic. So first of all, let's try to define higher education and what we mean by economic development, kind of the central tenets that we'll be talking about today. Then I think it's important to look at the current state of higher education in the developing world and around the world and kind of see how it's changed over time, just to kind of get a little status report and see, well, is this something that we could work with, right? Then we want to try to learn more about the costs and the benefits of higher education, kind of from a conceptual standpoint. How do we start thinking about the returns to higher education and what some of those development outcomes are? So we're dividing that into two categories, which we're going to talk about later: the private or personal costs and benefits of higher education, and then the public or the societal costs and benefits of higher education. And then we want to move on and we want to try to estimate what the return on education is for an individual and for society so that we can calculate what these private and societal returns are. And then finally, we want to try to look at what are some of the impacts of higher education on some bigger macroeconomic outcome, things that might be a little more difficult to measure. Things such as capabilities, development institutions, things like that. Let's just start with the definition here. So higher education is generally referred to as schooling beyond primary education and secondary education. So basically anything that happens after high school. So all of you guys are engaged in tertiary education or higher education once you decided to enroll in the university. And that would include both the college and, getting a master's or a PhD. So that's kind of lumped into that category of higher education. By economic development, that's sort of a term that gets tossed around places, but in general, that's the process by which a nation improves its economic, political, and social well-being of its people. So kind of an overarching umbrella of the things that leads to growth and development in a country, not just monetary. Economic growth is only looking at GDP, gross domestic product, and just a monetary measure of it. Economic development encompasses also these human aspects of development, which we are definitely interested in. So let's first take a look at the state of higher education around the world. So I just picked a few countries here. These are the countries that were in the book that I found that were listed here, and it just kind of shows a comparison of a few different countries, a couple in Asia here, a couple in Latin America, including Brazil, and then the United States. And let's start with the United States first. So we can see here that in the United States, pretty much everyone has some kind of education. So less than a primary education, that's pretty much no one in the United States. Few people in the United States, maybe about 4, 5%, maybe even less, 2, 3% only have a primary education in the United States. Some people have a secondary education, kind of after high school. They go on and find a job after high school. And then there's a large percentage, the majority of people in the United States go to college and get a tertiary education. Now that looks quite a bit different if you look at several of these other countries here. So for example, in Thailand, we can see that as many as 45% of people don't have even a primary education, or they haven't finished their primary education. So this is most likely in a lot of rural areas. It's common that that kids are taken out of school either because parents can't afford it or because there's too many other things that needs to be done on the farm. So we're not going to talk about primary education, but as you can see here, it's a significant percentage of people who don't even finish their primary education. Now, if you move up to look at tertiary education, so higher education here, that's significantly different than the United States. So look at Indonesia here, for example, which seems to have, sort of a lower level than Thailand in terms of its people who don't have an education, but also a very, very low level of people with a college degree, which could then, reflect different investments by the government in tertiary educations. And that kind of just varies in different countries here. Now, suppose we were to look at this over time, and we were to actually look at averages throughout the world. So this table here shows sort of how it's changed between 1975/1980 and 2005, which was the most recent year of the data here. So if you first look at high-income countries here, primary education seems to be pretty much universal. Secondary education, not universal in 1975, but pretty universal by 2005 and today as well. Tertiary education here seems to have grown significantly in the United States from about 34% in 1980 to the 62.3% as of 2005. So you can see changes also in the United States over the past 30, 40 years here. Now, if you look at some of these other countries, we can see there's definitely been positive trends here. So if you look at the tertiary education here, for example, in East Asia and Pacific, which includes China, for example, you can see it went from 2.5% in 1980 to now 20%. So that's an enormous increase. So the state of tertiary education has definitely changed over time here. And you can see even countries here, for example, in Europe and Central Asia, which has relatively high rates, haven't increased nearly as much as it has in Southeast Asia. There are some exceptions here. So for example, Sub-Saharan Africa, even if they have increased a fair bit, it's still quite low. So in Sub-Saharan Africa, that's generally where people fall the most behind in terms of tertiary education. So about 5% of the population here have gotten some sort of tertiary education. You can see here that even if primary education has been achieved in pretty much all over the world, you notice that some of the numbers are higher than 100%, and you may wonder why. Does anyone have any ideas why they're higher than 100% here? So the way these enrollment rates are calculated is that they're taking the people who are enrolled divided by the number of people within each age group. So for example, if somebody are repeating grades or somebody who's older than that age group is actually retaking primary school, they're going to show up as a higher than 100%. Yeah, so this may actually be a bad thing that you have this 117% because it means that there are a bunch of older people who should have finished primary school who's actually still taking it. But our focus is not on these things, it's on this thing here. But the one takeaway that I want you to get from this is that things have changed for the better. There's definitely more access to tertiary education. Enrollment rates have increased significantly in these 25 years. And between 2005 and today, I don't have the data for that, but it's possible that they have increased even more. Let's look at something called the Knowledge Economy Index, which is basically some index that measures a country's ability to generate, adopt, and diffuse knowledge. It kind of takes into account a lot of different things. And you can see here there's a huge distribution across the world here, which kind of corresponds to the data that you saw. Europe and the United States, the Western world, seems to have high levels of the knowledge index. And then you'll find a lot of the lower levels in Sub-Saharan Africa. However, you still see there's a lot of diversity within sub-Saharan Africa. Some countries, like Egypt, which is doing relatively better. And then you have countries like Sudan, Ethiopia here, which are not doing as well. And there's also a bunch of missing data here. And then there's a few countries here, Bangladesh, Thailand, that are sort of in the low category in South Asia here. Most of Latin America seems to be doing relatively well in terms of that index. So now let's think about why we should care about higher education, why this is important. Let's think about the conceptual reason that higher education may be important. First of all, is there a clock here? I'm always used to having a clock in the back of the room, so I have something to look at.
I can go grab one for you.
That would be great.
I have one, yeah, easily for you.
Thank you.
I'll make sure it's set on US time though.
Yeah, that's okay. I can live in different time zones. So in order to understand the returns to higher education, it's important to clearly lay out the benefits and the costs associated with this investment, because that's really what it is. It's an investment in the country's future and in individuals. So we need to separate between the private and the social benefits or costs. So by private benefits or costs, we mean the benefits or costs that are borne or paid by an individual. And by the social benefits and costs, we mean the benefits and costs that are paid for or accrued to a society of an individual's education. Great, thank you. I'm going to go until 11:10? Okay, great. So this distinction is very important. Why do you think this distinction is important between private and social benefits and costs?
Which purpose would the government want to invest more in?
Social benefits to help a majority of people. By investing individually, you are expanding that social benefit.
So suppose that, just as a thought experiment, suppose there were only private benefits to education, right? Suppose there are no social benefits to education. Would there be a role for government in investing in tertiary education? No. It's the same thing as the government doesn't go out and subsidize your restaurant meals, right? There's only private benefits to you going out and eating, you get well fed and you're happy. There may be social reasons to give food stamps and things like that. However, in general, the government doesn't go out and subsidize your car and subsidize things that have a private benefit to you. But the thing about education is we believe that there are some social benefits that are stemming from it. The fact that you guys are educated, we'll talk about that in a second, you go out and you do things and develop things in society that not just you benefit from, but that the entire society benefits from. So that means that if the government goes in, or the government doesn't do anything at all and doesn't invest anything, there's going to be an under-supply, an under-enrollment in higher education, because you're only going to consider your own private benefits. There's only going to be some private benefits. For example, you're thinking about, I can get a higher wage, I can increase my knowledge by getting a higher education, but you're only going to think of those. You're not going to think about the greater societal impacts, except maybe through your altruism. But in general, people are only going to think about the private benefits. So therefore, if there are large social benefits to higher education, there is a role for government coming in and subsidizing that for people, because it benefits the entire society. So that's why it's important to separate between these two and be able to estimate them separately. Excuse me. So what are some of the private costs and benefits of higher education? Let's talk about these separately. So let's think about the private benefits first. So let's start with the benefits. So what are some of the private benefits to higher education?
It's like you said, like a higher wage.
Yep.
Materialistic things, like you can buy clothes, house.
Exactly. That's the biggest one. That's the most important one.
Yeah.
What are some other potential ones?
I think you have a better understanding of learning more cultures, more people, more opportunities to get out there to get to know the world. Such as what we do here at Land Grant University.
Yeah. So to the extent that this increases your own personal well-being, so there's an emotional benefit, right? People like to be educated. They like to have that feeling. Oftentimes it makes the people making better life choices as well. It increases their health, the health of their children, which is sort of more of a societal benefit. But at least in terms of your own health, and there's other indirect effects on yourself that are not just monetary, in that people sort of have an enhanced understanding of democracy, critically be able to weigh facts and so forth. That comes with higher education, and that are not societal benefits. Some of them may have spillover into societal benefits, but they're still private benefits. What about some of the costs?
It's kind of like,
You probably know that very well since you're getting a college degree, and definitely very tangible costs here.
I was gonna say it's kind of like delayed gratification because you're spending all this money now to
Yeah.
hopefully get it more in the future.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's tuition, right? You've got to pay that tuition bill every month. And then there's one thing that a lot of people tend to forget. What's a big cost of getting a college education? Time, yes. So that's another way of putting it, but opportunity cost. You guys heard about opportunity cost? Yeah. It's a big concept in economics. I mean, you said you're economics, right? So opportunity cost is a huge thing. So foregone income. Right now, you guys are sitting here, listening to this presentation and, not making any money. I mean, maybe you're working on the side and all, but, you could be out there. You could have finished after high school and you could have gotten a job and you could have made a decent income. Right now, instead, you're sitting here and you're paying money throughout your 20s just so that you can increase your future potential. But that's also considered a cost. So there's the direct cost and there's the opportunity cost. That this might actually be larger than the direct cost if you think about the foregone income that you could have had if you had just a regular job that didn't require a college degree. So those have to be factored in as well. Now let's think about some of the social cost and benefit of higher education. So what are some of the social benefits?
Community development.
Community development. What exactly do you mean by that?
Like, for example, I think of like here at Ohio State, we are providing funding for people be trained in extension, and those that have degrees in extension are trained, go out and work in communities and help educate people about consumer sciences, agriculture, natural resources, and improving their communities.
Yeah, exactly. Education, these institutions like Langgrad University, like the Ohio State University, has extension people that are going out and making a difference in the community, educating farmers, educating people around to actually create social benefits. Exactly. Any other ones?
More educated people typically commit less crimes.
Yes. So there's definitely a reduction in crime aspect from this.
The economic development for the city itself.
Yep.
The spillover effect, like educated people being here, bringing spouses or family members who are also educated, who then increase the knowledge level in that city or region.
Exactly. So increase in knowledge level in some region, back to regional economics here.
Spillover effect.
Exactly. These spillover effects within the region that benefits everyone in that society. Okay. There's tons of other ones.
Maybe like the creation of more jobs.
Creation of more jobs, yes. If you have smart people like yourselves, you go out and you start your own business and then you employ more people, huge benefit, right? So there's plenty of these benefits, and in a lot of developing countries, these benefits can be even greater because you generally have, as you saw, very low levels of higher education there. So when some people go in, it's going to have a relatively larger impact because it's such a scarce resource in general. And it also could lead to things like women's empowerment as well, having women get higher education. So, there's lots of these different impacts. Some of that you guys that talk about, spillover effect, reductions in crimes. Children of educated mothers tend to be healthier, so it has a health effect on society. Lower fertility rates, lower child mortality rates, lower HIV/AIDS, for example. People being better managers, benefiting co-workers, all these spillover effects in society that could translate into just higher earnings for a society overall. They could be inventions that are enjoyed by others. People always use the example of, Bill Gates, dropped out of high school. And it's like, well, that's not the perfect example. But in general, people who get an education tend to go out and they tend to come up with great inventions. In a company like Microsoft, for example, all the people who are there are people who's gotten great educations, you know, and in order to develop all the thing, maybe the initial idea didn't come from that, but all the people who are currently working to produce all the great gadgets and the things that we use today are people who pursued a higher education, right? And then there's social costs. So what are the social costs of higher education?
Higher taxes.
Yeah. So that is exactly, you know, the money that goes into paying for all the schools and all that, which then indirectly comes from the taxes, exactly. So all the money that goes into building schools, paying for teaching, you know, paying my salary, for example, you know, probably paying your salary too, right? Yeah. And all the money that goes into building education institutions, all that stuff, that's a huge direct cost that will then hopefully yield these benefits. Then there's also the opportunity cost, which we have to think about again. So what's the opportunity cost on a social level? Imagine you're a dictator of a developing country, right? Let's say you're the dictator of Congo, and you're trying to decide if you should invest in higher education. What are the opportunity costs of investing in higher education institutions?
Those people could have started working earlier.
Yeah, or from a government perspective, it's where could you have spent the money elsewhere, right? So you have a bit of money, right? And if you put it all in higher education, that means you cannot spend it on child welfare programs or food programs or other things that you can do in a society. Huh? Or defense, for example, like pretty much anything else that you could spend the money on. There's competing uses of money. And as economists, we think very carefully about that. The fact that there's, you know, yes, is it good to invest in higher education? Oh, sure, if you have unlimited money. But if you have a limited set of money and it needs to add up to 100% of the budget, there is some optimal balance there. If you put all the money into higher education, that means you have no money for primary or secondary education. So every dollar that you put into higher education is a dollar that you take away potentially from primary education or building roads or defense or any other services that you provide to society. So that's why it's important to think about what is the optimal amount of spending. The optimal is not, oh, just let's pour money in. Having 100% enrollment ratio in tertiary education is not necessarily the goal, right? The goal is to have an optimal return on your investment in terms of social benefits, right? So let's think about education as an investment. And it has a rate of return, just like other investments. Do you guys invest at all? No? Not yet. At some point, you learn all about investing, right? You start earning money.
Huh? Someday when I have money.
Exactly, yeah. So you invest something you actually have. Well, you guys are investing in your education right now. But so that's why we want to think about education as an investment. But think of it as just a regular stock investment. You take some money, which is the cost, and you put it in, and you're hoping for a rate of return on that investment. You're hoping that you're going to get more money back than what you put into it. So the private return to higher education, you know, as you said, this is basically measured by people's higher wages. So that's exactly what's been done as well. You measure that as the increase in individual people's earnings due to earning that higher degree minus the cost of this education paid by the individual. And then you can divide by that cost itself to get a rate of return. It often ignores these intangible benefits, sort of emotional ones, because these things are very hard to measure. How do you measure the happiness that a child feels from getting, you know, a higher education, right? Those things are hard to measure, so generally we focus only on people's earnings. Now the social includes, in theory, the sum of all the social benefits that we listed earlier, right? All the ones back here. But those are very often intangible, and it's very difficult to kind of come up with a monetary measure for all these ones. So in practice, we have to do it a little bit differently. So one of the ways that we measure the social benefits is to consider the social rate of return, is to use the private benefits but the social cost and say, well, society is paying all this money for an education for people. let's think about the increases in people's wages. What is the return of the government's investments on every individual's private benefits, right? That's not exactly a social rate of return, but it's more of a social rate of return than an actual social rate of return, right? You can also estimate the effect on macroeconomic indicators such as overall productivity, GDP, institutions inequality, which are sort of measures of the societal impacts. They're not going to be perfect because you're not summing them up into some variable that are only the social benefits, and you can't really subtract out the private benefits here because these include private benefits as well, but you can sort of look at an overall impact of higher education. So I'll try not to get super mathy here, but I just wanted to include this because this is something that is going to be extremely useful no matter what you work in. I mean, even if you're not an economist, it's important to know net present value. Has any of you guys heard net present value before? No? Completely new concept? Okay. So a net present value is simply just a way to figure out how much something is worth when you have incomes that are happening at different points in time, right? So let's say I ask you a question, right? Do you want $100 right now, or do you want $100 50 years from now? Right now. Why do you want it right now?
Because I can use it right now. 50 years from now, I might not necessarily need it.
Yeah, that's.
How do I know that you're actually going to give it to me?
Yeah, so that's like sort of a trust thing, right?
Yeah.
But aside from all the trust thing, right? You can take the $100 I gave you right now and you can put it into a bank account, and 50 years from now you'll have that $500 plus maybe 2% interest or something. You can take it, you can invest it in something, right? So the fact that money gets a higher value, has a higher value today than it does in the future, means that we need to discount future earnings at some level. So think about education. Education is a perfect example of this because you're paying a cost right now. You're paying actual cash out of your pocket right now to get a benefit sometime in the future. And that benefit you get in the future is not worth the amount that you get in today's money. You have to discount it back to today's money to figure out. So let's say in the future you calculate that your earnings are going to go up. Let's say you just get a lump sum of money when you're like 50 years old. That's not realistic, but suppose you do that, right? And let's say you get $100,000 when you're 50 years old. Now we need to take those $100,000 you get when you're 50 years old, and we need to say, what is that worth today? And that's going to be a dollar amount that is less than the 100,000. So for example, let's say 50,000, right? So you get the equivalent of 50,000 today, except you get 100,000 when you're 50, and then you compare the equivalent value, which is 50,000 today, to the cost that you're paying right now. And now it's an equal comparison because you're comparing apples to apples. And that's exactly what this net present value calculation is. This is something that's being used to calculate the return on investments for anything that happens over time, right? So it basically means that you're summing up for every year the benefits that you get each year, subtracting out the cost in that same year, and then you're dividing by 1 plus this I, which is the discount rate. And this discount rate, that's something we're going to try to refine, because once we have these numbers, we can calculate what's known as the internal rate of return. You guys heard about the internal rate of return before? So the internal rate of return is the implied discount rate on a project where you're getting different levels of incomes and costs over time. So let's say this, just as an example, let's say this was 10%, right? That would mean that, let's say, next year, you get $90. Or sorry, next year you get $110. Today you get $100. Suppose that you're indifferent between those two. You'll either have $100 today, or you'll take $110 a year from today. That means that we're using a discount rate of 10%. So if that's your investment, and you're paying $100 today to get $110 in increased income a year from today, that implies an internal rate of return of 10%. If you're getting $30 or $130 a year from today, when you pay $100 today, that's an internal rate of return of 30%. So we can calculate what this return is when you're looking at all the years in your future, saying you'll be making $5,000, let's say $50,000 extra each year from you graduate until you die, right? And then you can go back and you can calculate exactly what this internal rate of return is. So I realize this is sort of a tricky concept, but hopefully you guys have some idea what it means, right? Any questions about internal rate of return? Okay. So this is an important concept. So now, when we have this, we want to be able to calculate what these benefits are, and we want to be able to calculate what these costs are. The costs are relatively straightforward. So let's think about sort of the private cost and benefits first. The private costs, those are just the tuition that it costs you to go to school, and you can factor in the opportunity cost as well, right? You can put all that in the cost one. So that's relatively straightforward. The benefits, however, how much your income increases in the future, that's something that has to be estimated using data, because that's not obvious. That's going to differ for everyone, but on average, we want to see how much that benefit is. And that's when we have to turn to regression analysis. Have you guys done regression analysis before? Okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. So.
Sorry, like 4 years.
Huh?
I haven't taken economics in a long time.
Okay. So.
Stats, yeah.
It's basically statistics. All it's trying to do is to say, the basic concept is, suppose you didn't have an education, a higher education, right? You have no higher education. How much income are you making? Suppose you had a higher education, how much income are you making? And then you just compare those two groups. That's sort of the simplest version of a regression. It's just a univariate regression, as it's called. To say that higher education, those people of a higher education have an income that is, let's say, 30,000 higher than the people who don't have an education. But then we have to control for other things as well, because in there's things like experience that matters, right? It's not just your education, but it's also how much experience you have. And there's a bunch of individual characteristics. And then there's a bunch of things like ability and things like that that you cannot measure, that you also have to control for. So this gets very complicated. But in the general sense, you're basically just estimating a wage regression where you say, W here, this is the earnings or log of earnings, just so you can talk about percentages, for individual I. Then you have some constant term. And then you have some coefficient here times this indicator for whether individual I has a higher degree. And if this is all we had here, not this and not this, what this beta 1 would measure is literally the amount of money that you would earn extra due to your higher education. These other beta 2 and beta 3 here also measure the effects of experience. So sort of keeping the higher education constant, once you already have a higher education, the fact that you now have more experience is also going to lead you to have a higher wage. So what this does is it's trying to set up a framework for trying to understand what are the things that affects your wage in the future. And there's several things that affect your wage, including, do I have a higher education? Do I not have a higher education? How much experience do I have? And then you can have a bunch of other factors which also explains it. So once you control for those other factors, you can estimate the effect of higher education given that everything else is constant. And that's what exactly we're interested in, because that's exactly the question we wanted to ask, is what are the benefits of getting a higher education in terms of your salary? So this beta 1 here, once you calculate that, and you can use data on earnings, education, experience, you can estimate these coefficients, figure out the impact of higher education and experience on earnings, and you can take that number and you can plug that directly into this B for benefits here, subtract out the costs, and then you can estimate this equation right here, figuring out what this internal rate of return is. And that's exactly what's being done in a bunch of studies. I mean, that was a very quick way of going through it, right? But that's essentially what people do when they calculate this rate of return for the investment of an education. And this is what they do also in other things. If you want to calculate the return on investment of buying a house, for example, right? You use the same kind of formula to do that. But for education, you have to do a little bit more in the sense that you actually have to calculate the impact on your earnings. So Let's now move over to look at what some of those impacts are. Now that we've talked about the conceptual framework, we've talked about exactly what those mechanisms should be, how to calculate it, let's talk about what the evidence has found. So there's tons of studies out there that have looked at the effect of higher education on economic development. And this paper here, the All Catch It Out 2014, which is looking at the impact of tertiary education on development, summarizes hundreds of studies. I think they looked at thousands of studies and they narrowed it down to about 600 some studies on higher education, the effect of higher education on development, looking at a bunch of different things. So, and then they divided those up into about 6 different categories here. One are individual earnings, just what we talked about here. And this shows the number of studies, I think, that specifically looked at that. So 48 studies found the impact of individual earnings. Then they were looking at the impact on economic growth, which is more of a societal impact. Productivity, right? So how much, for 1 hour of work, how much can each worker produce for that 1 hour of work? Technological transfer, how technology can be transferred across different countries and within a country. Capabilities, which are all the things that we think of sort of as like indirect effects, like health, nutrition, anything that sort of makes you a better member of society, like democracy, all those things. And then you have institutions, which is more specific to societal institutions. So this could be things like also like democracy, things like caring about the environment, all those things, institutions in society, and the effect of that. So you can see here, there's a bunch of studies on all of these things here. This thing shows what the results are saying overall. So in individual earnings, the size of the effect is large. So there's a consistent findings that higher education leads to large increases in individual earnings. These are very consistent, and the overall strength of the evidence is very strong. On economic growth, the size is about medium, but the results are consistent, and the evidence is sort of about medium. Productivity, the effect is found to be sort of small on average, but the results are quite inconsistent. Some studies, as we talk about in a second, show lower effects on productivity, some show higher, and the overall strength of the evidence is limited. And that's the same thing for technological transfer as well. In terms of capabilities, we do find an effect here. Institutions, we do find a small effect, but it's consistent. So these are sort of the general findings if you look at all those studies. Let's try to dig into these a little bit more. So for example, this is looking at the private returns to higher education. It's also looking at this social rate of return, right? And as I said, it's social in quotation marks because these are social costs, but private returns. So this says, if you take $1 of government money and invest into higher education, what is the effect on private people's earnings? This says, if you take $1 of your own tuition money and put into education, what do you get back in terms of a return on your education? And here you see these are rates of return. So just what we talked about, the concept of a rate of return, that's exactly how they're calculated. So first they estimate the effect of higher education, or 1 extra year of higher education, for example, on earnings. That's a benefit. They subtract out the costs, and then they do the net present value calculation to calculate this internal rate of return, and that's exactly what these numbers mean. So when we talked about, before, a 10% return on your investment, you pay $100 today, you get $110 back a year from today. That's exactly what these numbers mean. So for example, the private rate of return is you put $100 in today, and this is equivalent to getting $126 back a year from today. So you can see here that relative to primary and secondary education in low-income countries, the return to education is very high. Private return to education is very high. It's about the same as for primary, and it's higher than for secondary education. However, in high-income countries like here, your return to a primary education was very high. Your return to a tertiary education is high, but just not as high as getting a primary school. So every year of primary school earned you more than every year that you spend going to college, right? Which makes sense, because if you don't have a primary school education, it's very hard to be functional in our society today. It's perfectly fine. You can perfectly be functional if you just finish high school, but you're going to earn an additional rate of return. So high school was as productive as getting your college degree, right? If you look at the social rate of return here, so this is a reason that a lot of countries are not investing in higher education. Because if you have the situation where you had earlier, as we saw in a bunch of countries, where there isn't 100% enrollment in primary and secondary education, you're getting a much higher rate of return on your investment if you invest in those as opposed to in tertiary education. You can put $1 into your primary education and get 21% back. You put $1 into your universities and you only get 11% back. So this kind of speaks to the fact that there's an interrelationship between these different concepts. So you need to invest in all of them together. If you just invest in tertiary education and you're forgetting about these, then there's going to be no people who's actually benefiting from it, right? So there's a very interesting interrelationship between these three things here. And this is a reason that people argue that a lot of countries are not investing in higher education exactly because of this. Now let's look at the impact on economic growth. So there is some mixed evidence on the effect of education on economic growth. There's several studies, particularly in low-income countries, that find that higher education enrollment rates are less significant for economic growth compared to primary and secondary education. So this is kind of consistent with this finding right here, except this was on an individual level. This is on sort of an overall economic growth level. Also, there are some studies that found absolutely no relationship between enrollment, that shouldn't be a rather in there, I don't know why that came in there. No relationship between enrollment, that should be ratios, sorry. Enrollment ratios or number of university graduates and economic growth. But then there were some studies that found a positive relationship, right? So they use different methodologies, right? Not all studies are the same. They look at different regions, which is why we're saying the evidence is mixed here. But there's some studies, for example, this study right here, which offers a comprehensive estimation of the effects of higher education on the growth of per capita income in African countries, going on between 1960 and 2000, found that a 1% increase in the average years of higher education increases the growth rate in per capita income by approximately 0.09 percentage points, right? But this is one study out of many. And the takeaway from this is that the evidence on growth is mixed. There's no conclusive evidence there, just like it is for the private and the social rates of individual returns. In terms of productivity, there's some evidence, again, the evidence is mixed here, but there's some evidence to suggest that higher education has a positive impact on productivity. But the relationship is not conclusive, again, given that there's a lack of available data, and there's some lack of an impact in many, or some barriers to this impact in many low-income countries. So some of these barriers to impact could be, for example, that people don't have access to primary and secondary education in the first place. It could be that educational institutions perhaps are dictated by political goals, so that the government says, oh, here are the things that you need to teach, right? So it could be potentially higher if universities are, for example, given more academic freedom. One study finds that higher education raises the rate of technological convergence. That basically means how technologies converge across different countries. So, the United States has a certain level of technologies. Other countries have a lower level of technologies, let's say in sub-Saharan Africa. How these levels of technologies converge over time is this technological convergence. So they do find that higher rates of education reduces or increases this convergence, meaning that potentially low-income countries are able to catch up to some of the richer countries through this process. There's also other studies that suggest that the lack of access to up-to-date knowledge within higher education institutions is limiting the impact on productivity in some low-income context, again related to these barriers to impact. Then if you think about the impact on people's capabilities, there's a number of studies that show the positive impact of tertiary education, so higher education, on graduates' capabilities such as health, nutrition, political participation, and women's empowerment, right? So it does have some general increase or have some general effects on sort of society as a whole, more intangible things that are not specific to money. Leads to better health, better well-being measures. For example, a study in Sudan showed that higher education was associated with lower fertility rates, where women with university education having an average of 33% fewer births than the country on average, about 50%, so even a higher effect in urban areas, right? Sort of seeing all these other non-monetary effects of higher education as well. You think about institutions, the small number, there's not a lot of studies on this, but there's a few number of studies that do show a positive impact of higher education on the strengthening of institutions. There was one study that used worldwide panel data. So panel data is basically data that are for multiple countries and over time, right? If it's just one country over time, that's a time series data. If it's just all the countries, but for one period in time, that's cross-section, but a panel data set is one that combines both of those. So there's a really nice data set that shows the link between the expansion of higher education and guarantees of political rights. So more education, higher education leads to more political rights for people. Also associated with increased political stability. And looking at 51 developing countries, there was one study that found a significant association between increasing rates of higher education and a slow rate of deforestation. So also having effects on environmental impacts that we might care about. And then finally here, higher education has an impact on inequality. However, there is some mixed evidence of that. So from a theoretical perspective, you can imagine that having access to higher education may only benefit certain people, especially if there is no subsidies, right? The people who already have a primary and a secondary education are the ones that are going to be able to have access to higher education. These could potentially be people in cities who have access to more money. And if you take money away from other services, put them into higher education, you may actually be taking away money from rural programs that are helping people in rural areas. So just increasing access to higher education could increase inequalities within the country. So I understand that you guys are interested in learning something about inequalities as well, sort of how we measure inequality. So this is generally measured by the Gini coefficient, and I think we'll take 2 minutes and talk about the Gini. Do you guys know what the Gini is? Okay. Huh?
They probably don't.
They probably don't. Okay. So just to finish up here, there was one study that found some evidence of an impact of higher education on increasing income inequality in Indonesia, largely due to rising inequality in the earnings of urban residents, right? So urban residents were making more money, people in rural areas were not seeing much of an impact, increasing inequality. And there's also a lot of studies that have found no impact on inequality. So let's just briefly go through this measure of inequality, which I think is an important measure. So suppose you lined up the people in a country, right, from the poorest to the richest, right? So this would be the absolutely poorest person in the country. This is the absolutely richest person in the country. And then you did a cumulative percentage of their income. So you started with income. So let's say you guys are lined up according to your income, right? I know you guys are all college students, so probably it's going to look very similar. But suppose, you earn the least and you earn the most, right? Not to, no reflection on you guys. It's just random, how I chose this, right? And then we said, okay, so you earn, let's say, 2% of the total income. The two of you earn, let's say, 10% of the total income. 3 of you earn, let's say, 40% of the total income. And all of you obviously earn 100% of the total income. So suppose you plotted that, right? And the graph looked something like this. The 45-degree line means that everyone has the same amount of money, right? So if 10% of the people had 10% of the income, 50% of the people had 50% of the income, you'd be along this line here. So as you can see here that if you're along this line here, that means that you have no inequality. But inequality is reflected in sort of how far below this 45-degree line you are. So that means that you can calculate the level of inequality by saying, well, let's take this area A here and divide that by the total area that's available here, A plus B, and you come up with a number. And that's what's known as the Gini coefficient. It's just simply a measure of the level of inequality. If you have perfect equality, you're going to have a Gini coefficient of 0. If you have perfect inequality, meaning that nobody earns anything except for the richest guy who earns everything, you're going to have a Gini coefficient of 1. Given the 4 minutes we have left here, the general theoretical range is between 0 and 1, but the most values in the world fall between 0.25, which means high level of equality. So for example, where I'm from in the world, Norway and Scandinavia, has some of these very low numbers, some of the lowest level of inequality in the world, to 0.65. So for example, South Africa, we were saying you were in South Africa, right? Or you're going to South Africa, that's probably the most unequal country in the world. There's huge differences between rich and poor, right? So there's a lot of people who earn very little, and there's some people who earn a lot. So that corresponds to a Gini coefficient of about 0.65. And then you can calculate the impact of higher education on these Gini coefficient numbers. And you can look at Gini coefficients or segments of people within the country as well, and you can see how that changes. Okay. So what are some takeaways and challenges? So tertiary education, as we have seen, does have positive impacts on society, especially on people's individual benefits, right? There's definitely positive benefits to higher education, but there's often a lot of barriers to that. So a lot of individuals don't have the money to make that investment. Suppose you knew that if you put $1 million in the stock market today, you would have $1 billion a year from now. That seems like a no-brainer investment, right? But if you don't have that $1 million in the first place, nobody's willing to lend it to you, then how are you going to be able to make that investment? So a lot of people in developing countries who would like to make that investment in their tertiary education and go to university are not able to, simply because they don't have the money and nobody's willing to lend them the money because of dysfunctional institutions and so forth, right? To actually make that investment. You guys may have college debt, right? That was, you took out that money because you didn't have the money yourself to invest in your university education so that you can earn a benefit on that in the future. But a lot of people don't have those options, which means there's definitely barriers to tertiary education, even if it's available, which then again makes a case for subsidizing university education as well by the government. As we talked about, all the levels of education are interdependent, so focusing not just on tertiary education, but also on primary education and secondary education together, and looking at it holistically is important. There might also be some significant barriers to these impacts. For example, if there's insufficient quality, if there's limited academic freedom or inequality of access. As we talked about earlier, all these barriers can limit the impact, and we might see greater impacts of higher education if we could remove some of these constraints here, which is often difficult, right? Designing optimal higher education institutions, that's a whole other topic, which is very difficult. There is a lack of studies on the impact of higher education and economic development. You might think that that's wrong, given that we found 600 or thousands of different studies, right? But remember that there's so many different things that you're interested in studying, and looking specifically at economic development, more aspects of economic development is going to be important. And however, the majority of existing studies do show large private and social benefits, specifically private, but also social benefits to higher education. So I believe that's about the time that we had, unfortunately. I'd like to continue, but I'm sure you guys would love to stay for another 4 hours, right? You just don't have anything else going on. But yeah, feel free to ask any questions. I know we're out of time, but I'll hang around for another few minutes if you guys have questions. So
just to kind of wrap up, I want to just to make sure you guys knew, like, the reason why I wanted this lecture to be part of this is because, number one, all of you as being students in higher education, I wanted you to sort of recognize to some degree the benefits and costs that you have, and then as potentially people going into development work, because a lot of our programming here in the college is all about development, knowing your place in the world in terms of having access to tertiary education, I think is going to be very important moving forward. The second thing I wanted you to know about is just to have exposure to the language, because a minority of our students in the global option come from an econ background. So for me, it was incredibly enlightening having taken a class as part of my doctoral program to understand it. It's sort of like all these social issues, and there is a way of mathematically looking at things, which was something that was, believe it or not, a novel concept to me, that it ties to economics, and there are ways. So it may have been a little bit sort of over your head seeing the equations, but honestly for me, it's sort of just enlightening just to see that there are equations and the types of things that people look at in order to pull that together. Yeah. So, and then finally, just again, going into development, I wanted you to have a sense of the basics of like some of the work. For instance, Mark Urbach came in and talked to us about some of the work OSU is doing, and specifically in Tanzania, at Sokoine, talking about increasing their access or their reach as a university. Yeah. And so what are some of the economic pieces that would help make decisions or measure the impact in that way? So, so that was my purpose of having Jon come in today and talk with us about the higher education and the impact on development, was just because of those factors, and he wanted you guys to have at least some exposure to this knowledge content.
Yeah, and even if you didn't get all the math right now, and you can't go back and like run a million regressions yourself, and calculate net present value, at least you've heard about the concepts. So I can guarantee you that at some point in your life, no matter what you're going to do, you're going to run into these concepts. Like you're going to hear, especially now, it's always like you hear something and then you see it everywhere, right? So I'm sure now you're going to hear, internal rate of return, you're going to see net present value, return on investment, regression analysis. Like I'm sure you're going to see these concepts come up in some context later on in life. And now, at least you've heard of it. It's like, oh, I've heard about that before. And you go back and you can look at the lecture, you can go online and just search for it and be like, okay, yeah, I think I have some idea what it is, right? And if you're more interested in it, you can do your own research. But you didn't need to understand that to understand sort of the takeaways from all this. So, but I do think it's important to tell you how these things are calculated, because when I introduce things like rate of return, right? And I talk about these other returns to higher education, what does that mean? Where does that come from, right? I showed you sort of on a very high level where that comes from and how it's actually calculated, because there is a lot of math behind all these numbers. So yeah, I wish you good luck with all your travels and fun and exciting things. That's really exciting. I often wish I was back in college and I had all the opportunities ahead of me.